All right, let's just jump right in. We're going to start with one single number that the report puts front and center because it really anchors this whole entire problem. £2.84 billion. That is the annual bill for temporary accommodation that UK councils are footing right now. I really want you to keep that number in your mind as we go through this because it's not just a cost, it's a symptom. It's a symptom of a much, much deeper failure in the system. And you know, that number leads us straight into this central paradox that the whole report is really built on. Just read that quote for a second. How on earth can a system be worth so much money with these incredibly high asset values, creating all this wealth for homeowners, and at the same time be so completely broken that it's causing the £2.8 billion problem Alex just mentioned? It's like owning a priceless diamond-encrusted watch that doesn't actually tell the time. Sure, it's a valuable asset, but it's failing at its most basic job. And that paradox, that's the engine driving this entire crisis. So the report actually gives this brokenness a name, a technical term that you've got to understand to get the rest of us. It's called failure demand. As you can see, the definition is expenditure incurred because a primary system has failed to operate effectively. So in our case, the primary system that's failed is the supply of permanent affordable housing. And because that's broken, we are forced to spend billions and billions on the backup, on the emergency system.
Right. And that is such a powerful idea because it totally reframes how you look at the problem. Let me try an analogy. Imagine your roof has a leak. The primary system, your roof, has failed. Now you've got two choices, right? You can spend, I don't know, a couple of £1,000s to get a roofer out to fix the actual hole. That's solving the problem. Or you can just keep buying buckets. Every week you go out and spend 50 quid on bigger, more expensive buckets to catch the water. Well, that £50 a week, that is failure demand. You are spending money because the system has failed, not to fix it. And that is exactly what that £2.84 billion is. It is our country's national budget for buying bigger buckets, while the hole in the roof just keeps getting wider and wider. It's this constant draining expense that creates zero long-term value. You don't end up with a fixed roof, you just end up with a house full of really, really expensive buckets.
And this chart, wow, this really shows you just how many buckets we're buying. Just look at that curve. This isn't some stable, manageable problem. It is an accelerating crisis. The spending has more than doubled in just 5 years to get to that £2.84 billion figure. And the report breaks it down even further. It says over £1 billion of that is what it calls dead money. It's going straight into the pockets of private landlords for nightly paid, totally insecure housing. It's not building a single public asset. It's just plugging a hole night after night after night.
So that leads you to the obvious question, right? If the problem is so obvious and the cost of the buckets is just so astronomical, why in the world don't we just fix the roof? Well, the report points to this huge structural problem in government itself, and it calls it the wrong pocket problem. And this slide here, this explains the inertia perfectly. Imagine government is a big dysfunctional household. The council is the person whose job it is to buy the buckets. The NHS, well, they're the one paying for the asthma inhalers and the mental health support when the family gets sick from all the damp and mold. And the Department for Work and Pensions has to support them when they can't work because they're sick or stressed. Now, the council knows deep down that spending £10,000 to fix the roof would save the NHS and the DWP £50,000 in the long run. But here's the catch. The council doesn't have that £10,000 in its budget, and it has no way of accessing the £50,000 of savings that are going to show up in the other departments' pockets. Everybody has their own budget, their own pocket, their own silo. So the council is basically forced to just keep spending money on buckets because the huge savings a real fix would create, they're only going to benefit someone else's bottom line. That's why the system stays broken.
Okay, so we've spent the first part of this really digging into the scale of the problem. We've talked about failure demand, the wrong pocket problem. It's a pretty bleak picture, I'm not going to lie. But what makes this report so important is that it doesn't just diagnose the disease, it spends most of its time laying out a cure that is already working in the real world. So let's shift gears and move to the solutions. We're going to look at a working model from the London borough of Barking and Dagenham, and it's all about reframing the state's role, not as a passive regulator, but as the master developer. So how does this master developer idea actually work? How does it make money? The real genius here is in the financial plumbing, which this slide maps out. It's a 4-step process they call the revolving fund model. Okay, step 1. Instead of just selling off its land for a quick one-time cash payment, what the report calls a sugar rush, the council transfers its land into its own development company, called Be First, as equity. Think of it as an investment. Step 2. The council, because it's a public body, can borrow money really, really cheaply from the government's own bank, the Public Works Loan Board. Step 3. The council then lends that same money to its own company, Be First, but at a slightly higher commercial interest rate. And that brings us to step 4, That little difference, that margin between the cheap rate the council borrows at and the rate it lends at, that creates a profit. And that profit becomes a brand new sustainable revenue stream that can fund public services year after year after year. It literally turns a one-off asset sale into a perpetual income machine. And this table just lays out the strategic difference so clearly. Look at that first line, primary goal. For a traditional house builder, the goal is shareholder profit, period. For the Barking model, it's about delivering housing and, crucially, capturing the value for the public. Or look at land strategy. The traditional model is land banking. You buy up land and just sit on it, waiting for the value to rise. The Barking model is build out rapidly. The entire philosophy is different.
And for me, the most important line on this whole table, the real big picture game changer, is that last one, risk profile. The traditional model is cyclical. What does that mean? It means when the economy goes south, private developers slam on the brakes. They stop building to protect their profit margins. This is what's called pro-cyclical. It actually makes recessions worse. But now look at the Barking model. It's counter-cyclical. Because its main goal isn't just profit, it's also avoiding those massive social costs of homelessness. It can actually afford to keep building right through a downturn. It can stabilize the local construction economy, keep people in jobs, and most importantly, keep delivering homes when the private sector has packed up and gone home. This is such a profound shift in thinking. The state isn't just another player in the market, it becomes the market stabilizer.
Now, to be fair, the report doesn't just paint a rosy picture. It dives right into the risks. This slide shows the straw man critique. By becoming a developer, the council is suddenly taking on all these massive risks that are normally handled by the private sector. Market risk if house prices fall, construction risk if a project goes way over budget, and interest rate risk if the cost of borrowing goes up. If the council's company were to fail, the liability lands right on the local taxpayer.
And look, that is a 100% valid concern. But the steelman defense on the right, this gets to the very heart of the whole philosophy. Yes, of course, there are financial risks. But the state is playing an entirely different game. For a private developer, the only profit that matters is the number on the final spreadsheet. For the state, profit is also social. It's the $2.84 billion in temporary accommodation costs that it avoids spending. It's a healthy, productive citizen who has a stable home. And it has a flexibility the private sector just can't match. If the for-sale market completely freezes up, a private developer is stuck. But the council can just pivot. It can convert those homes from for sale to for rent and just hold them as the long-term public asset. The state can play the long game in a way that a publicly listed company worrying about its next quarterly earnings report simply cannot.
Okay, so the Barking model gives us a new way to deliver homes. But even the best model in the world is useless if the most fundamental ingredient, the land itself, is just eye-wateringly expensive. So this brings us to the next major part of the report, the first of 3 big unlocks they talk about. We have to unlock the land, and to do that, we have to tame the speculative market that sends the costs into the stratosphere. And to really get this section, you have to get your head around this other key concept, hope value. As you can see, it's the speculative value of land that's based purely on the hope of getting a more profitable planning permission sometime in the future. So it's the gap between what a piece of land is worth for what it's used for right now, say as a field, and what it could be worth if you got permission to build 100 luxury flats on it. Let me try another analogy for this one because it's so important. Imagine you've got a plain, empty field. Right now, as a field, it's worth maybe £10,000. That is its existing use value. But this field happens to be on the edge of a growing city. A developer doesn't see a field, they see a potential housing estate. So they are willing to pay £1 million for it. Not because it's worth £1 million today, but based on the hope that they can get planning permission. That extra £990,000, that is hope value. It's a payment for potential. It's basically a bet on a future planning decision. And the crazy thing is, the public sector, the local council, has to compete in this casino, paying this massive premium for land based on a value that only exists because of a decision the public sector itself is going to make. The system forces the public to buy back the very value that it creates. It's madness. And the scale of this isn't trivial, it's immense. The report crunched the numbers and estimates that if we could just remove this speculative hope value from any land that's compulsorily purchased for social housing, the potential annual saving to the public purse would be this number, £4.5 billion. That is a truly game-changing figure. It could completely reset the entire economic equation of building affordable homes in this country. But again, the report is very careful to look at the other side of the coin, the risks. The case for reform is simple. Councils could buy land at its actual current value, which would make social housing financially possible without needing massive government subsidies. The risks, though, they're pretty significant. Landowners might just refuse to sell. They could go on what the report calls a capital strike and just wait for a future government to reverse the policy. And you can bet that every single purchase would get tied up in years of expensive legal battles over what the fair price is.
Yeah, that's the core tension, isn't it? But the big picture strategic benefit, which the report argues for, isn't necessarily about using this power all the time. It's about having the credible threat of using it. Think about it. If a landowner knows that the council can legally buy their land at its simple field value, they are suddenly much more likely to come to the table and negotiate a reasonable price voluntarily. It's a tool that disciplines the entire market. It's like having a superpower that you rarely have to use because just the knowledge that you have it is enough to change everybody's behavior for the better.
All right, so we've talked about a new delivery model and a new approach to land. But that still leaves the huge elephant in the room question, funding. How do you pay for all this? Building at this scale is going to cost hundreds of billions of pounds, way more than the government can just borrow on its own. And this brings us to the second big unlock in the report, unlocking capital. The strategy here is all about building a bridge to the world of institutional capital. We're talking about the trillions of pounds managed by pension funds and insurance companies who are just desperate for safe, long-term places to put their money.
And what's so fascinating when you dig into the details is just how perfectly aligned the needs are. Let's really look at this chart. Over on the left, you've got pension funds. What's their job? Their job is to pay out pensions in 30, 40, 50 years' time. So what do they need? They need investments that are super low risk, that are very long-term, and that are protected against inflation.
Now think about the income you get from a portfolio of social housing. The rent is basically guaranteed by the state through the housing benefit system, so it's incredibly low risk. Tenancies are often for life, so it's very long term. And the rents are usually linked to inflation. It is a perfect match. A pension fund's liability is a person's 30-year retirement. A social housing portfolio's income is a 30-year rental stream. It's a completely symbiotic relationship. The state needs patient long-term capital, and the pension funds need safe long-term investments. This whole section is about finally connecting those two dots.
And one of the key financial tools the report highlights for building this bridge is something called the income strip model. So here's how it works. A council builds a block of flats. It then sells the freehold, so the actual ownership of the building, to a pension fund. The fund gives the council a big lump sum of cash right up front. Then, the fund leases the whole building back to the council for, say, 40 or 50 years. The council still manages the building and the tenants, and it pays the fund a steady, inflation-linked rent. At the end of the lease, the building ownership transfers back to the council for a symbolic fee, like £1.
So on the surface, this looks amazing, right? The council gets this huge cash injection to go off and build even more homes, and the pension fund gets the safe, long-term income it's been searching for. Win-win. But the report rightly points out there is a potential trap here. What happens if the rent the council has to pay the fund is linked to really high inflation, but at the same time, the central government puts a cap on the amount of rent the council can charge its tenants? You know, in 2023, inflation was around 11%, but the rent cap was 7%. In that kind of situation, the council gets caught in a financial vice, losing money on every single flat. The income strip can easily become a golden cage if it's not structured very carefully to protect the taxpayer.
Now, it's not all about these huge deals. The report also highlights a really clever idea for unlocking all the smaller sites out there. It's called the Small Sites Aggregator. The best way to think about it is like a mutual fund, but for land. All across our towns and cities, you've got these little forgotten brownfield plots, an old garage site here, a disused depot there, that are way too small for a big developer to even bother with. So this model bundles hundreds of these little sites together into one big portfolio. And suddenly, this bundle is big enough, maybe £100 million worth, to actually attract a major pension fund. You're basically creating an institutional-grade investment product out of all the scraps that everyone else is ignoring. And by standardizing all the planning and legal work across the whole bundle, you make it super efficient, and, this is crucial, the actual building work can be given to local, small, and medium-sized builders, which helps to revitalize a whole part of the construction industry that's really been hollowed out. Okay, so we have a model for development, a strategy for land, and a plan for capital. But none of that matters one bit if you don't have an industry that can actually build the homes at the scale and cost you need. And that brings us to our final unlock, unlocking delivery. And this part of the report, it calls for a pretty serious rethink about what we mean by modern methods of construction, or MMC, because the story here is definitely not what you might expect. For years, MMC, factory-built homes, was seen as the silver bullet for construction. But the report makes the argument that we need to be incredibly specific about what type of MMC we're talking about, because the reality for one part of that sector has been absolutely brutal, and this point is so important. Let's just look at the numbers. The volumetric modular company Ilk Homes, which was once the poster child for this whole sector, collapsed owing over £320 million. That's a staggering figure. And this wasn't just a one-off, one company that got its business model wrong. The report makes it clear this was a systemic problem. Legal & General, a huge, well-funded insurance company, poured a fortune into a massive modular factory, and it also closed after losing £176 million. These aren't small startup failures. This is a catastrophic failure of a particular model of construction. And this table from the report explains exactly why these companies went under. The model they were all using, the one that burned through £500 million of investment, is called volumetric. That means building entire 3D boxes or modules in a factory. And if you look at the cons column there, you can see the problem. This model has an incredibly high cash burn just to keep the factory lights on, and it's very, very inflexible. You need a massive, guaranteed, non-stop pipeline of orders to make the economics work.
And our UK planning system is the exact opposite of that. It's fundamentally stop-start. You just can't run a Toyota-style production line when your supply of building sites is so unpredictable. So the big strategic pivot the report argues for is away from this rigid, cash-hungry volumetric model and towards more flexible, panelized systems. This is where you make flat panels, like a whole wall with the windows and insulation already in it, in a factory, and then you just assemble them on site. It's still way faster than traditional building, but it doesn't need the colossal factory overheads, and it's much more resilient to planning delays. It's about being smart and resilient, not just being fast.
Okay, so we've gone through the nuts and bolts of land, capital, and delivery, but the report's final section makes this really crucial point that honestly ties the whole thing together. This entire system, this complex machine of finance and construction, is ultimately worthless if it doesn't have a democratic foundation. It has to be built with the community, not just imposed on it if it's going to be legitimate and sustainable for the long haul. And this slide here really ties everything we've talked about together into one coherent 6-point roadmap. This is the entire argument of the report in a single view. Number 1, mandate the Barking master developer model for councils. 2, enforce the land value reforms to make land affordable. 3, roll out that small sites aggregator nationally to unlock all those forgotten plots. 4, harness that pension fund capital. 5, pivot our industrial strategy to that smarter, panelized timber frame construction. And finally, step 6, which holds it all up, democratize the whole process, using things like resident ballots for state regeneration and supporting community land trusts for long-term community ownership. You can see how each step logically builds on the one before it. So when you take a step back and you look at that whole integrated system, with the state playing such a central active role in everything, it's really easy to ask the question on this slide. Is this just a strategy of government versus the market? Is this a call for some kind of state takeover of housing? And the report's answer to that is a definitive no. This is not about government versus the market. It's a strategy of market making. It's about the state stepping in to fix the systemic failures, to de-risk the whole system so that private capital and private enterprise can participate fairly and effectively. It's about creating a stable, predictable environment where everyone can play their part. The goal, and it's summed up perfectly by this final quote, is to create a housing system that builds wealth for the many, not just the few. It's not a vision of state control, but of a rebalanced partnership aimed at finally solving one of the most fundamental challenges that we face: